LinkedIn conference. Great to see so many familiar faces and new faces as well today. Normally it's a very valuable and interesting session, and hopefully I can contribute to that with my talk, which is going to look at the international application of the NEC. So looking at where the NEC is being used outside of the UK. So I'm going to look at where it's being used and why, which countries are adopting it, what's the driver for their adopting the NEC forms. Then look at the issues being encountered in its adoption in those locations, particularly related to certain cultural and legal environments that you're operating within. And then I'll look at the future for the NEC International and where we think it's going to go, the areas of particular growth and success moving forward. And in terms of producing this talk today, I've drawn upon my own experience. Most of my work tends to be international. I spent 3 years in the Middle East working with NEC contracts, and since 2006 I've been supporting the Hong Kong construction industry adopt the NEC forms. And for the last year or so I've actually been living in Hong Kong pretty much, working on a major infrastructure project. I've also reached out through the LinkedIn group and had contributions from a number of different people, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, where the contracts are also being used quite heavily, and they provide some backup and support. So as a starting point, I think before we look to the international environment, it's worth just recapping why the NEC became a success here in the UK, why it's become the sort of de facto contract for major programmes of work like Thames Tideway, Crossrail, etc. And it's interesting, the sort of bit of theatre we saw earlier today around the past and the history, that's what really created the driver for change in the UK. In the late 1980s, there was a lot of adversarial behaviours, poor behaviours within the actual construction environment, and that led to various reports and reviews of the industry. The key one being led by Sir Michael Latham in the early 1990s, that recognised that the industry was fragmented. There was lots of claims, there was bad behaviours, a lack of collaboration. And in that review, Sir Michael Latham actually recommended the NEC form of contract to be used much wider in the industry, creating this driver for change, this momentum to move away from the past behaviours, the bad behaviours of aggressive contracting styles. The contract was adopted early on by leading companies, the likes of BAA, the water companies and others adopted it for major projects and major programmes of work, and they became advocates and supporters for its wider adoption. The target cost option it was first introduced, I think, was the only published form of target cost contract at the time. Since then we've had the ICME Burgundy book and other contracts have come out like PPC, but at the time it was the first target cost arrangement, and that was a driver why a lot of clients adopted it and started to use it. Adjudication. The NEC brought in adjudication way before the Housing Grants Constructive Regeneration Act. In the early editions, the consultative edition, the late 1980s, early 1990s, the first edition, adjudication was in there, because it played to the idea of the NEC of proactive decision making, getting issues resolved at the time, not waiting to the end. And so that was a driver that supported it. And then when we had the Act came in to support it statutory, that gave further support to the use of the contract. We then had the creation of the user group. Again, a really good idea from the NEC, creating that user group, that forum, somewhere to champion it, to highlight best practice, share experience, become advocates for its use. And then for the third edition, we had the OGC endorsement, and that really increased its take-up by the public sector. The government got behind it, the government recommended its use. And on the back of that, we built a track record of success. I think a lot of people in this room, I assume, are sort of supporters and advocates of the NEC, believe it is a better contract, a better way of contracting. The momentum's been built in the UK, and as I've said, it's now become the default form of contract, and the ICE has stopped producing the old ICE forms, moved across to the NEC. In terms of, by volume of spend or value of spend, NEC is probably the biggest contract in the UK now. So a 20-year track record, driving success in the UK, built upon this driver for change, this need to move away from traditional ways of operating. In terms of international application of the NEC, the first thing to say is the NEC has always been designed for international use. And in fairness, even from the very first editions, it was trialled internationally, and it's been used in South Africa virtually from day one. So it's always had an international angle to it. I don't know, for those who read the NEC User Group newsletters, going back a year or two, His Honour Humphrey Lloyd QC did quite a detailed article reviewing the use of the NEC internationally and declaring that there was no bars to its use in different geographies, different locations. And again, say that's no surprise to the drafters who designed it to be jurisdictional neutral. The clause is to be worded to be used in any location. You know, the NEC comes from a common law background here in the UK, but designed to be used in civil law jurisdictions as well, and has been used successfully there. And the contract gives you choices of law, choices of language, allowing you to tailor it for particular locations. So always designed with this international angle at its heart. The core clauses, main and secondary options, are all designed for global application. They are jurisdictional neutral. They can be used anywhere. In terms of the dispute resolution options, there's two options. W2 is designed for the UK only, to comply with UK legislation. W1 is for use internationally, anywhere else in the world. In fairness, the reality is that is often amended in different locations to comply with other provisions of law, but it is designed to be used outside of the UK. And then we have the Y clauses, and these are jurisdictional specific. And so from day one, the NEC has tried to create particular clauses really for the UK use in YUK1, YUK2, 3, taking into account UK legislation. But they've also now drafted New Zealand options, and we have YNZ1 and 2 for use in New Zealand to comply with legislation there. And the expectation, I think, is that further regional specific Y clauses will be created as the contract becomes popular in different locations. So certainly, again, trying to tie into this international market and make it compatible with different legal systems. In terms of where the contract's been used, it's been used, say, from South Africa, right from its original early days, and it's still heavily used there now. New Zealand, a growing market for its use. Hong Kong, another growth area. And it's interesting that a lot of these countries tend to be sort of ex-colonial country with strong links to the UK that have been some of the early adopters. We've also seen it used in the UAE, Australia, the Philippines, India, Netherlands, and then other locations like Qatar, Germany, Norway, Denmark, Italy, Canada, and Bermuda. Wish I got the Bermuda job. It sounds quite a nice place to go for a project, but hopefully there'll be more there in the future. And in terms of supporting growth, the NEC itself has been driving quite heavily this international agenda. They're looking to try and grow its footprint, try and grow use of the contract in different locations. And so originally we had a single NEC user group for the UK really, albeit there was a South African influence in it. But now what they've done over recent years is created NEC user groups for certain locations where the contract is becoming increasingly popular. So we now have an Asia Pacific user group based out of Hong Kong, and we have an Australasia user group based out of New Zealand but covering Australia as well. And it's those two areas where the NEC sees the main areas for growth, and I'm going to concentrate on those two areas in the next few slides because, you know, historically over the last few years that's where the real interest and growth in use of the NEC has occurred. And they've also now created a rest of the world user group as well for those locations that at the moment don't justify a user group of their own. So in terms of Hong Kong, so I've been involved in Hong Kong since 2006. NEC is now becoming a very frequently used contract there. It's a growing market for the NEC, it's a growing market full stop. There's a huge amount of infrastructure work planned in Hong Kong over the next few years, some multi-billion-dollar projects going through at the moment. They themselves had a similar report to the Latham report, produced by Tang in 2001, Construct for Excellence. And that reviewed the Hong Kong industry and actually found, like the UK back in 1985, it was broken, that there are problems there. It's rife with claims, the supply chain is fragmented, it's not working efficiently, there's a lack of collaboration. On the back of that report, the Hong Kong government looked at different forms of contract and recognised that the NEC was a form that could play to that Tang agenda, play to try and improve collaboration and performance in the industry. First pilot project was awarded in 2009, and since then we've had over 30 projects being undertaken in Hong Kong, and there is a strong pipeline of work going forward. The lead department that's been driving the use of the NEC has been the Drainage Services Department, one of the government departments. And they've been pushing very heavily. They did the first pilot project in 2009, and they now use it as a default contract for all their civils work. And we've also seen private companies starting to adopt the NEC. Companies like China Light and Power on the electrical side, MTR on the railway side, starting to adopt it and use it. And the big thing for the NEC is the Hong Kong government announced last year that for all projects tendered this year and next year, NEC should be the default contract choice for those projects. So moving away from their standard forms to the NEC. Though there is a slight caveat that the word generally is used in that statement. So there is a little bit of wriggle room, which I'll come back to about that. So in terms of Hong Kong users, transportation, you've got the Highways Department and the government using it. You've got the MTR, the Mass Transit Railway, using it. In fairness, the MTR started to use the contract, but unfortunately not for any nice big chunky rail projects. Their first trial project is the refurbishment of a swimming pool. So from slow starts, hopefully it'll grow, but that's the first MTR project underway. China Light and Power, they've been a very heavy user of the contract over recent years, particularly the term services contract for maintenance works. The building side, we've got the Architectural Services Department, Hong Kong Academy, which is a university college development, and also the Hong Kong Jockey Club, who interestingly ran one of the pilot projects for the NEC back in the late 1980s, and then put it away for 20 years and have dug it back out again and starting to use it. And then Water, Drainage Services Department, and as I mentioned, the Drainage Services Department has heavy users, and then you've got Civil Engineering Department, Electrical and Mechanical Department as well using it. So quite a broad range, the majority being government departments with a few private sector clients mixed in as well. In terms of the forms of contracts being used in Hong Kong, as you may expect, ECC is the predominant form of contract being used, but also the PSC is being used by the government now. We're seeing the subcontract being used on some of the larger projects being tendered now. Term services contract being used largely by China Light and Power, and the framework contract as well. In terms of the main options, predominantly option C has been the most commonly used option, and probably not always correctly. There seems to be a driver in Hong Kong, if we're going to try the contract, let's try it all. Let's try target costs at the same time. Let's go all the way down the route of doing something quite different to the norm, when actually maybe option A or B could be more suitable for some of the smaller projects. But they are starting to do that now and starting to use other main options. In terms of secondary options, as you may expect, they've gone for quite a traditional approach, picking the sort of usual suspects of sectional completion, delay damages, retention. Unfortunately, not so much use of the more innovative options around bonuses for completion or KPIs, etc. There are no regional specific clauses yet for Hong Kong, though I know the Hong Kong government itself is working on standard Z clauses to take into account local practice, local ordinances. So hopefully over time we may see why HK1, 2, etc. being developed for this location. In terms of the Z clauses we tend to find being adopted in Hong Kong, one of the primary ones is around giving greater control over the supply chain. And that comes back a little bit to the market over there and the way it's currently structured. There is this lack of trust. And so the client wants to impose more stringent value for money tests on the supply chain being created by the main contractor. So actually some Z clauses that sort of cut against or cut across what the NEC is trying to achieve, which needs to be addressed, and we need to try and build that trust in the local market to avoid some of these things. Mediation is commonly introduced. That's the default sort of dispute resolution process in Hong Kong. There is no adjudication law. There are no standard adjudication provisions, but some clients are using it with the NEC. Anti-corruption requirements also kick in quite heavily in Z clauses. Again, lack of trust in the industry, a bit of a history of people having sort of brown envelopes and bribery and corruption practices in the past, which are addressed through Z clauses, and then take into account local and governmental policy requirements. In terms of issues being faced in using the NEC in Hong Kong, the first one is a fairly obvious one. There's a lack of practical experience. It's new to that marketplace, training's required, education, creating NEC compatible documents, and in fairness that's being addressed. There's a lot of training courses being provided there. We have the NEC User Group, the NEC providing training. Other people from this group here have been over there providing training courses. So that's being addressed. One problem we do still see though is delegation of powers. It's a very hierarchical sort of setup in Hong Kong, and if you've got variations, changes, compensation events that need to be authorised, very often they have to go up the chain to high levels, boards, governmental committees to agree these changes, even for quite low values. So that cuts across some of the proactive, instant decision making of the NEC, and that can be quite a challenge. But again, the industry is trying to address that through ways of working. Dispute resolution I've mentioned, mediation's common in Hong Kong, adjudication infrequently used historically, though they are looking to bring in a law, hopefully this year, to bring statutory adjudication into play. Only in relation to payment disputes, but the use of adjudication, having that statutory support for it, hopefully will again support the NEC and that quick decision-making process. Biggest issue in Hong Kong, though, is creating the driver for change. So, in the UK, we had the Latham report, we had the industry getting behind the NEC, trying to change those 1985 behaviours we saw earlier. In Hong Kong, we're still facing that challenge, trying to get the industry to move away from their existing contracts, their existing ways of working. There is industry support for the NEC. Construction Industry Council, RICS, Consulting Engineers, ICE, the NEC itself, all pushing for its use. There's a number of advocates in the market trying to drive its adoption. And what we've also seen is a number of problem projects recently. There's a number of projects being done by the MTR, including the high-speed rail link, the XRL link from Hong Kong into mainland China, that's having some severe difficulties. It's in the press regularly in Hong Kong. It's a government-funded project. It's going to be 2 or 3 years late, 20–30% over budget. And that was procured using the old-style contracts. So hopefully some of these big problem jobs will help drive that change, help create the momentum to move away from the traditional ways of engaging contractors. But the biggest issue you still find is this cultural change required. That the industry, as I've said, is fragmented, there's a lack of trust. Trying to build that mutual trust and cooperation, that way of working between the parties, is still a challenge. You've also got a real issue about loss of face in the marketplace, people not wanting to get it wrong. It's the sort of market where if as a senior person you select a form of contract and it doesn't work, you can lose your job. So people do have some genuine fears and concerns over recommending something new and different. So there is a bit of a culture of fear about its adoption, but as we get a track record of success, hopefully that will start to change. Another thing we're seeing in Hong Kong and elsewhere is people trying to take the best ideas of NEC and put it into their existing contract forms. They say that imitation is the finest form of flattery. Well, we're seeing a lot of people trying to imitate the best of the NEC. And a good example is the Housing Authority in Hong Kong, who recently redrafted their own standard contracts and brought in things like early warnings and programme requirements and lots of really good ideas they've taken from a contract that remained nameless. So there is a slight concern that rather than adopt the NEC, they'll just cherry pick the best bits. But in some ways, as long as they achieve the aims of the NEC, not such a massive issue if it improves the industry. So in terms of the future for Hong Kong, as I've said already, there should be a huge growth in the use of NEC because of this requirement from the government that all projects 2015–2016 should use the NEC. But it's this term generally. It's not a mandatory requirement. They should use it unless there's a good reason why not. And certainly in the last 6 months that I've been involved in Hong Kong, the actual number of projects coming out to the market has been slow. People have tried to think of reasons why not to use the NEC. People have been reluctant to actually be the first into the market with their particular projects. And there's also a question mark in the industry locally around what happens after the 2 years. Is it we do it for 2 years, then great, throw it away, back to the traditional? Or will this become embedded and the way to go from that point forward? And I know the government is thinking about maybe changing that window from 2 years to 5 years to try and encourage its use and make people aware you can't, try and spend the next 2 years trying to avoid using or doing the project to get past this NEC initiative. You're going to have to go out to market anyway. I think the biggest thing though, and this is where maybe people in this room can play a part in our companies, our businesses, forums like the LinkedIn group, is what we need to try and do is drive the agenda for change in Hong Kong, try and support people moving away from the traditional, sell the benefits of the NEC, case studies, capturing success where it's being used to try and drive its use. And I think one of the big things would help is if some of the major clients over there, MTR, the Airport Authority, some of those big private sector clients adopted it for a major project. That's what it's missing at the moment. It's a big major project to showcase how it can add value. So that's what we need to push for in Hong Kong to try and move it forward in the future. Looking at New Zealand and Australia, I've had to rely on my colleagues in the group for the information on these slides, so if anyone's got any sort of questions around this, then please do feel free to ask, but I'm not answer them in too much detail. But in terms of history, NEC was first used in New Zealand in 2002 on the port of Littleton coal handling facility, and the view from the market was that was quite a mixed project, limited success. People began to question whether NEC was actually the right way to go. But then in 2004, Meridian Energy adopted it, trialled it on their Manapuri refurbishment scheme, and that was seen as a success. And on the back of that, Meridian Energy has now adopted the NEC suite for all of their projects, and they are by far the biggest user of NEC in New Zealand. They average about 25 contracts, $30 million of spend, using the entire suite of NEC contracts. In 2010, there was sort of a second wave of adopters in New Zealand, mostly local authorities and some utility companies starting to use it. And in 2012, we had the first, and I think to date the only, Australian project using the NEC, and that was a Meridian project over in Australia, and it was the Mount Mercer wind farm. So again, hopefully that will start to build some use there, but it's limited in Australia today. Then in 2013, on the back of the terrible earthquake that happened in Christchurch, Christchurch City Council started to adopt the NEC for a number of the rebuilding and refurbishment programmes, and they're building type works, quite high profile. So hopefully that's going to be another driver for adopting the NEC, using it on those types of projects. And actually, it's people from the UK who've gone over there who are pushing its use within that council, so far successfully. So in terms of 2015, the estimated value of work being done under NEC contracts was $100 million, and about 10 clients adopting it, 30, 40 projects. So it's a reasonable slice of the market, but when you look at the construction activity at 13 billion, it's still fairly small. So it's there, but it's early days, it's just starting to embed into the marketplace. The clients that are using it, I've gone through this already really, you've got energy, Meridian Energy, Transpower, you've got water companies, aviation, road maintenance, and then the building side of it with Christchurch City Council. In terms of the contract forms, the ECC is the most commonly used, albeit Meridian do use the entire suite of NEC contracts, with the exception of the adjudicator's contract. Term services contract is being used for road maintenance schemes and by Christchurch City Council, and the PSC contract is being used to engage the consultants for the new town hall, the town hall refurbishment and the new central library. Interestingly, in New Zealand, it's options A and B that are the predominant forms, and C is not used. And the feedback from the market is that there's a concern by using option C and creating savings, the council will seem to be giving away public money, which I always find is a bit of a strange thing to say, really, because those savings were only created through option C. If it was options A or B, those savings wouldn't be there to share in the first place. They'd all sit with a contractor. But that's the market feedback. Nervousness over target cost arrangements in terms of how they operate, the costs of operating them. And again, in terms of secondary options, we see a traditional approach. So things like inflation, changes in law, sexual completion, delay damages, etc. So again, not moving to the more innovative KPI type options, sticking with the more traditional options. And what we do see in Hong Kong is the YNZ1 and 2 regional specific clauses are very popular, do encourage its use because they're ready to go out of the box and comply with local legislation. In terms of issues in New Zealand and Australia, so far the early adopters have been private sector clients. They've been championing the use of it. People from the UK who've gone over to New Zealand, Australia are trying to champion its use, drive people to adopt it, whereas the government has actually been reticent. Within New Zealand, there's quite a feeling of, the government shouldn't tell people what to do, the government should take a back seat and let people and the industry decide what's best. So the industry is, so the government is reluctant to try and support or endorse its use. They think the market knows best. They don't want to undermine existing local forms done by industry bodies. And probably the biggest issue is they don't recognise the benefits. They're not really seeing the reason or the driver for change. The local industry, there are some supporters of NEC there, but also a lot of the local bodies have vested interest in their own contract forms and don't feel the need to change. There's already quite a high degree of trust within the New Zealand construction industry. So they don't feel that they need 10.1 as much as, say, the UK did in the late 80s or Hong Kong does now. So they feel that's less of a driver for it. And there's also quite a bit of local resistance in terms of it's not invented here, things aren't broken, the industry works okay. They don't feel that driver for change, that incentive to move away from the existing forms of contract, the existing ways of working. So, you know, they've also got issues around project managers' delegation of power and remoteness causing issues and a lack of programming skills. And obviously one of the benefits of the NEC is its program requirement, agreements of change, dealing with extensions of time, etc. And they don't have, in New Zealand particularly, the skills to cope with that and therefore to get the maximum benefit out of it. And that's also holding back its use to an extent. In terms of the future, again, in New Zealand we've seen a similar pattern where the actual local contracts have been updated recently and again have tried to steal some of the good ideas from NEC to try and make themselves remain the predominant forms of contract. And that's likely to happen over the short to medium term. However, the growth of NEC is expected to continue. We are going to see it expand and be further used, but from a slow base on a slow burn. What we're hoping is the use of the NEC on the Christchurch rebuild projects, high profile, you know, very innovative projects, high degree of aesthetic quality, etc. If they're a success, hopefully that will encourage the wider use of the NEC. And again, as with Hong Kong, what we need is more local advocates, more industry support, more selling of the benefits, trying to again demonstrate the NEC is better. It's better than the existing forms of contract and it should be used. In terms of the Middle East, I'll touch upon this briefly. I myself was based in the Middle East for 3 years and I worked on the Al Raha Beach project, which at the time at 7.3 billion was the world's largest construction project and it was all NEC. So this was in the late noughties, about 2006-07. It was a huge project, all NEC, all Option E, hugely successful for its early years. However, it became a victim of the market. When the recession hit in 2008, 2009, the whole Al Raha Beach project was scaled back dramatically and people saw the NEC as part of the problem. Rather than blaming the boom and bust cycle of the industry, people saw that actually the NEC contracts on that job, that's been a bad job, let's move away from it. And they've reverted now to FIDIC contracts for the remainder of that project. So unfortunately, its track record in the Middle East has been blighted by its use on some of these problem projects. What we're hoping is potentially we may see some opportunities in Qatar for it to be used, where there is a need for a great demand for consultants, contractors to go over there to meet their building demands. You know, if they still have the World Cup and such like going forward. We'll wait and see. But, you know, in fairness, I think the NEC themselves don't see the Middle East as a huge market for them. And their efforts are going into the Hong Kong market and the Australasian market as growth areas rather than the Middle East. In terms of other notable locations and projects, South Africa, as I've said, long-standing use of the NEC, Eskom, Statoil, Transnet have used it, predominantly on the power, oil and gas side, heavy civils. And then recently the Wits University did an £80 million project, which was on the NEC website if you do look at the case studies on there. Philippines, it's been adopted there on a £158 million road project. That's early days, but again, if that's successful, demonstrates the benefit, hopefully it'll get further use in that part of the world. India, it was used on the Indira Gandhi International Airport, Terminal 3. That was a couple of years ago now. And in fact, I don't think it's really caught on the back of that in the Indian market, but it has been used there historically. And we've also seen it used in mainland Europe on the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And again, that's 119 million, so a fairly major project. So there are notable overseas projects, but perhaps not the track record in these locations of a building momentum of use. In terms of competition, what other contract forms are there out there rather than the NEC? Well, the biggest competition the NEC faces is from the local contracts. So in Hong Kong, there's government standard forms. If you go to New Zealand, Australia, there's industry standard forms. So in all these locations, there's already an existing incumbent form which is going to be a rival for the NEC. And by them stealing all the good ideas from the NEC, that becomes an even greater level of competition. In terms of other international forms that are out there that sort of cross geographies and different locations, FIDIC is probably the biggest competitor. I don't know how many are familiar with FIDIC in this room, but It's a very widely used contract, very popular in the Middle East, used by a lot of development banks for different projects, and that is probably the key rival for the NEC. However, FIDIC is a traditional type of contract, quite adversarial, lacks a lot of the good ideas, proactivity, and benefits of early warnings, risk registers, etc. that the NEC can bring. But that's what's out there as competition. So, in terms of the future for the NEC internationally, I think what we need to do, and I say we, the industry here, the NEC advocates in this room, is try and demonstrate and sell the benefits of the NEC. Whenever you go to places like Hong Kong or to the Middle East and you say use the NEC, they say why. And you can give the background, the flexibility, the clarity, proactivity, but they want metrics, they want case studies, they want proof that it's actually better. So I think there's probably something we could all try and do around that, is to create these metrics, try and capture good case studies, good examples of where it's really delivered benefits, why and how, to try and sell it internationally. We need more employers to champion it in these different locations, particularly on major projects. And I think we can all be advocates for change, trying to drive its adoption, trying to encourage its use on a wider basis. The NEC itself can support with more specific why clauses being created, more active user groups in these locations. I think the biggest thing for us all is selling the benefits. It's creating the same driver for change in these locations that we saw in the UK historically that made the NEC such a success over the last 10, 20 years here in the UK. Okay, that's it from me. And just some thanks to those people who helped produce the presentation on a remote basis.